Today's guest is Kathryn Edwards, Dr. Kathryn Edwards. She's a PhD economist who also has 275,000 TikTok followers, which is how I've got to know her. She's a podcast host, Optimist Economy, and she's a writer and often and contributor all over the place. She also, it's interesting to me that a TikTok economist, a labor economist, has a 275,000 TikTok followers, which I think is a great job. And wondering how do you go from a PhD in economy, end up on TikTok, and say like, this is where I think I should be?
It's kind of a long story, but it ended up being quite logical along the way, even though it's definitely feels more like of a pivot than it was. My PhD is in labor economics, and I specialize in where the labor market and public policy meets. So this would be, what type of jobs and what are the employment patterns of people who are on food stamps? What do we know about the relationship between Social Security and labor force participation? Things like that. I look at like the big federal programs and the workers or near workers that they're targeted. My dissertation was on unemployment insurance. So no one cares about unemployment insurance, and no one really cares about or really empathizes with unemployed people, right? It's their fault that they don't work hard. Well, in the pandemic, I had been out of school for about 4 years and was working at a think tank when the pandemic happened, and unemployment insurance suddenly became arguably the most important program that the federal government has. It doesn't have a huge expert base. If I were to tell you everybody who's a PhD in some subject, whether it's public health or economics or sociology, who knows something about Medicaid, go to a conference, like they'd take up 6 hotels, like they'd fill a city of people. If you do the same thing, but for unemployment insurance, it's like, there's dozens of us. There's just really, we would take up one room. So I ended up being just catapulted into a very public facing job, starting with almost the third week of the pandemic, being on the news almost every day, talking to people like yourself almost every day, just explaining what was going on with the program and with the economy. And even as interest in unemployment insurance died down, people had other questions that I could answer about the labor market, about Social Security, about wage inequality, about what have you. And I think it took me a minute to be comfortable with doing that full time, kind of stepping into that part of the career, but I eventually did. And I came to the conclusion relatively early on that you have to meet people where they are. It's a relatively luxurious position to just assume people will come to you. And so if you want to meet people where they are, they were on TikTok. So it was terrifying, but I took the phone, turned it around and started to record. And I was overwhelmed by how successful I have been, actually.
That's awesome. I love, so being at Rand and then saying like, no, I want to do this other thing, which, I feel like I was so resonating with what you were talking about, like the small number of people, like I'm a Presbyterian pastor, which there's less than 1 million Presbyterian in the country. And then the pastors are, a much smaller subset of that. And then also try to meet people. I could talk about churches wanting people to come to them all the time, but this is not necessarily a church podcast, even though I am a pastor. One thing I really love about your work and the sort of like the way that you present what you do and what you said was like meeting people where they are. You've said your goal isn't to persuade people, but to inform them and to make them feel like they actually understand what's going on. What made you decide that was the move, or that's where you needed to be? What your sort of your niche was?
Yeah. Well, it started as a workplace restriction. RAND is a nonprofit think tank, and it gets a lot of federal contracts from Democratic and Republican legislators and administrations. And they have a very strict, they do not endorse pieces of legislation, candidates, politicians, like they say that their job is to inform. And so when I started writing about unemployment insurance, right, that was a very natural hue of, people need to understand this program. I basically was, allowed, this is going to sound bad, but I was allowed to say what all the evidence would suggest in a persuasive but not conclusive way. We do not try to convince people of an opinion. We try to inform people so that they make their own opinions. And that was a very, for an opinion writer, which is what I ended up becoming, that's a really tight restriction. Most opinion writers start with like, here is what I want you to think, and then I'm going to get you to, I'm going to get you there. And it veers towards just bombastic and screedy and insulting and just histrionic in how they present things. And Rand was like, look, that's just not allowed. Like we are explanatory writers. And there is a space for explanatory journalism on the opinion pages, but like you need to keep it explanatory. So that was almost like a 2-year training wheels writing opinion columns while I was at Rand. That was the restriction that I had to meet. And a lot of people checked that I kept to that rule. And by the time, I think when I first started, I was like, I can't believe someone wants me to write anything. So I never really thought about it. And then by the time I was leaving, I thought that it was an invaluable lesson in how to communicate that, like, this is a better way to use your authority as a PhD economist, is to present it as inform and empower as opposed to kind of cajole and persuade. And I think it was not random, right? If I was at Rand, it really fit kind of how I like to interact with the world. But I think forcing that restriction on me made me really embrace it by the end, of that this was the way that I was meant to communicate. And I think if I, have the philosophy that you should meet people where they are, I have kind of like a twin philosophy that you should know where you sit. If you were to gather together, everyone in the US who wants, so what's something like super reasonable? Paid family leave for every worker so that they can take care of a newborn, of a partner, of a child, of a parent who's dying, that they have the dignity and the means to do that, and it's not a luxury. Well, if you gathered up all the people in the room that want that, you're gonna have a lot of people sitting in a lot of different chairs, and you do best when you do the job from your position. And there are people who are on the ground advocates knocking on the door. There are people who are, writing polemic, screedy pieces or putting something together. There are people who can talk to donors and get money for campaigns. And I think I understand that I'm not any of those people. I have an understanding of the evidence. I can code switch between the most esoteric economic language and everyday language, and I can write and I can talk pretty. So that's what I will do. But I think it's not necessarily stay in your lane so much as know where you're supposed to sit and embrace that, and embrace who's next to you. Embrace the people who want the same things but different paths to get there.
I love that. This is I'm remembering now why I felt so connected to your explanations on TikTok. And I think sort of one of the things that we do here, and I do as in my ministry, is like literally I've sat down in front of the congregation and be like, all right, here are my lenses. Like, here's where I'm sitting. Like, here's my history. Here's how I see things. And then, and one of the things we talk about, I know the church and politics is a nightmare subject, but sort of like we talk about politics, like in the way that we do stuff together, not partisanship. And so how do we I love the idea of seeing, like, knowing where you sit and being comfortable in where you're sitting, but also recognizing that there are people who are sitting in a different chair and they might have it, but that doesn't, you're not trying to get them in your chair. You're just trying to let them know what the chairs are like what's the furniture in the room. All right, so here's where I'm going to switch a little bit to some more explanation. I'll help if you can help me with some explanation, because my wife is tired of me sort of ranting to her. My wife is also a pastor. Actually, you mentioned paid family leave. My wife was one of the people that was part of the authoring of that sort of policy for the Presbyterian Church USA, for the denomination. So this is something that particular issue is something that we've been very involved with in our spaces. So I just think it's in the Presbyterian world, we would call that providence that you brought that up. Okay, so this thing, it messes with my head. And I'll read a headline like markets tumble on disappointing earnings call. And the company made like $1 billion, but it was a different billion than they thought they were going to make. Or the customer confidence index number is basically just a survey of how people feel, as far as I understand. And that moves things. So is the economy just like feelings? Is it just like some fundamental, is it like just all vibes?
It's a lot of vibes.
That's so disappointing.
It's not all vibes, but vibes matter. So I would say one way to think about it, well, economists, even as back as far as the 1930s, they would call this animal spirits, and that sentiment matters in the economy. But it's a tangible place. I mean, you're transacting so often in your daily economic life. And so if you think of something like, we think things like the consumer sentiment, there's a few big surveys that measure consumer sentiment, and this asks them a battery of questions that are much more tangible than like, how you feeling, but are, like, do you feel confident in the labor market? If you were to lose your job now, do you think it would be hard or difficult to find, or hard or easy to find one? Are you thinking about purchasing a good, why or why not? Like, do you think inflation will be higher or lower? It's asking them a little bit more grounded questions about where they think the economy is going, and then they put it together in an index. And the index is just a way to summarize quite quickly how they feel about a whole host of things. And the reason why this index matters is because it can be really predictive of people's economic behavior. So not necessarily what I do today, but when I need to buy a car, it's not a 2-hour decision. People buying a car is a months-long process often of like what car they want, if they test drive, how they feel about it, like if they research insurance rates beforehand. Same thing with like buying a house or major purchases. As soon as you add the element of time to an economic decision, your view on how things will unfold over time becomes a factor. And so your view, like the economy is going to be in the absolute gutter in 6 months because of X, Y, or Z, that's going to affect whether or not you buy a car, or affect whether or not you buy a house or take a new job. So it is vibes, but it's really, I think on some level, your ability to weigh risk in the short and long term that we put out as a sentiment, because a risk index was maybe just too confusing. That said, I do think the stock market is basically like a haven for gambling addicts that is like more socially acceptable than actual gambling. And there is some real value behind how companies, there is some truth of how companies are valued in the stock market, but there is a lot of feelings, and they are incredibly dramatic. And so I tell people, take the stock market with a grain of salt, because it's basically like the most dramatic friend you ever had betting constantly. So there is underlying truth to the value expressed in stock relationships, but movements beyond like maybe 4 months at a time, it's just a lot of, high drama.
Is that why it seems like, I feel like, I try to be very specific about where I get my news from, or my information from, and even the ones that I find to be the least dramatic, I guess, often like lead with stock market numbers. Like, why is the stock market? Because I've heard that same sentiment, that the stock market is not a credible reflection of how people are doing or how the economy is doing in the short term, like the ups and downs of the stock market.
There's a frequency bias to the stock market because it moves every second of the day. We only get reports on our economy's growth every 3 months. But if we had an hourly measure of whether or not the economy was growing, it would be at the top. But they report on the news, and a lot of economic measurements are simply not new that frequently. Mm-hmm. with advances in data and computing, many institutions, particularly Federal Reserve regional banks, are trying to put together more weekly, sometimes daily measures of larger economic indicators, where like the official indicator will come out every 3 months, but they're putting together a predictive index that comes out more frequently in order to get people's attention to better stories. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's a new number every day. It's always
so
news.
The attention economy, right?
I don't think that's a function of today's attention economy. I mean, that's just how the news works. Like, it has to be a new number for it to be newsworthy. And a lot of the in between. And so, I mean, part of the reason why people look to the stock market is because this is a group of people that are in some ways making speculative bets about how they think major actors in our economy are doing. So even if you were looking for substantive information from the stock market, it does come out all the time. I mean, if the stock market sinks, that could be a forecast of broader economic activity. So there is an angle to it. I just think it because it moves hourly, or because it moves every second, it gets a ton of attention. Some of that is deserved, some of it is useful, a lot of it's not. Being able to discern that can be tough.
Yeah, so that's feedback loop is where I get nervous, right? Like, so, like, it's, the stocks are cratering, and so people make a run on the bank, like, and it's sort of like it's like a spiral sometimes. Which may be, so here's a question I have, sort of like a little more on the ground. So I have people in my congregation who are genuinely scared, right? Like tariffs, layoffs, the war, cost of like gas prices, all this stuff. What do you actually say to someone who asks you if you think it's going to be okay? Or do you think it's going to be okay?
Being okay doesn't mean bad stuff doesn't happen in the interim. So I do think it'll be okay. Our economy is fundamentally very strong and envy of the world, really, still. And if anything else, I mean, our economy has taken a beating over the last 4 years. The punches that have been thrown our way, we have fared better than other economies, and then we've inflicted a lot more wounds than other economies have, and yet we're still doing okay. So it should give you a sense of just how strong our economy is, that we could have some of these truly erratic, irrational, destructive policies, and even 12 months later, we're like, all right, well, we're still going. Like,
so it's like the resilience of it is...
The resilience of the U.S. economy is very much underappreciated because we are... But the other thing I would tell people, so this is my like two takes from it. A recession is always coming. We have a cyclical economy. Recessions will happen, and they tend to happen somewhere between every 5 to 12 years. So if a recession is coming in every 5 to 12 years, you should kind of always, maybe stay ready so you don't have to get ready. Like, have an understanding that the rug can be pulled because you live in a capitalist economy. And frankly, it doesn't have to be pulled in a recession. We associate recessions is like when the economy is bad, but there are lots of bad things that the economy does to people even when it's outwardly good. So I think that the focus on recessions can be a little maybe too intense. Even at their worst, 90% of people in America at a terrible recession have a job if they want one. So it's really, a recession isn't an oscillation between things are good and things are bad. It's just the share of people. There are always people who are doing good. There's always a small share of people who are doing bad. A recession means that small share got a little too high for our taste, and we're in a recession. But unemployment rate's never zero. So I mean, keep all that in mind. But I guess the takeaway I have, and this is, I mean, admittedly, as like a big government liberal, like capital L, I want the government to do more things, is, you hear all the time this deficit mindset of like, we can't have nice things. Like, y'all, we can't have paid family leave. Employers couldn't handle it. We can't have there's 30 million workers that don't have a paid sick day, and almost everyone in the U.S. can be fired for calling in sick. We can't change it. Our economy needs people to be incredibly low wage. And it's like, well, we did have a guy come to office and basically take dead aim on 3 different sectors through a series of completely irrational tariffs, and we were okay. So if we can handle tariffs, I'm pretty sure we can handle paid family leave. And I think, you said that explanatory and I try to speak to all people. I'm from a very conservative family and conservative part of the country. And, what I tell my conservative family members is, you've had your day. To the extent that conservative economic policy was going to solve problems, it's had about 5 decades of runway to do it. We've had 5 major tax cuts this century: 2001, 2003, 2012, and 2017, and 2025. There are 5 tax cuts. So if tax cuts were going to solve housing, healthcare, childcare, or any other issues, they would have done it by now. We've deregulated almost every major industry. We stopped enforcing labor law, and we certainly haven't passed it. That is what has been cooking for 25 years. So you've had your day, and the pendulum needs to swing back. And it's not about who's right or wrong. It's about the economy always evolving and not wanting to put like all your eggs in one basket. We've had eggs in the conservative basket for quite a long time, and we need to like move back the other direction. And that it's less about right or wrong and more about responding to the economy's needs. In the past, probably when a lot of conservatives were growing up, the economy was getting towards the end of a really liberal era, and the economy needed some conservatism. We're now at the end of a really big conservative era, and the economy needs some liberalism. And you grow up in a certain time, you become convinced that this is a foolproof philosophy that you must stick to in all cases, but the economy doesn't give you the luxury of being an ideologue. You have to adapt to what it needs and make policy fit that, and not what you believed because you like Ronald Reagan or you liked, LBJ. You have to respond to the economy in real time.
Man, wow, like, amen. I love that. That's everything about that. I love one of the things I really sort of like, what I felt like you were starting with, and then was the sort of taking a bigger picture look, like a step back, as you look at the economy, good, bad, like making those, and then trying to take a more, like a larger, like macro level kind of conversation about stuff. And I also, huge, I like to say I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. Like, I've never voted for a Republican. Not to say that I don't have Republican friends or think I might at some point, but it's just I grew up, like my first election to vote in was Clinton. So, like, and he's not exactly liberal, but that's a whole. I get excited about those particular issues. So I really appreciate that, and so. In this, I think the question I was going to ask you is like, back to as you talk about this, and like, so, as you talk about politics and economy and these kinds of things, and being able to, how can you like I felt like I was doomsaying, like everything's going to be terrible, like I hear this all the time, like tariffs are terrible and all, all this stuff, and then how do you like? I would love how you just did that. So you sort of answered my question before I even asked it. It was about like how you can present a particular argument, present a picture of what's going on without saying, like, there are things that are bad and that is bad and people are being left out, and also it's not all bad and we're not stuck. We can change it. Yeah.
I mean, a theme I come back to again and again is just kind of like a very plain spoken reminder that if you were dealing with economic struggles in your life, we have not done that much to help you. Mm-hmm. There's been very little intervention into almost any market to put the thumb on the scale of like, we need to make sure people can afford things, or we need to make sure people have access to things, or we need to make sure workers earn things. We don't do much because, we are a pretty conservative, economically conservative country. And I think a lot of people would say and see that's why we need to stay conservative, when really it just means that we have been late to the game for certain things. So, one example I give is childcare. Mm-hmm. So the childcare in the United States is unaffordable and inaccessible. There's not enough of it, and people can't afford the stuff that we have. It is provided privately through the sale, where you're basically trying to make enough money off of this, the care of children. It's a market failure. It doesn't work. And the U.S. is absolutely heading towards massive public intervention in childcare. And there's a couple ways that you can see it. One of them is that the current system where we sell childcare on the private market and that parents who want it can just go out and buy it, it has almost no public defenders. You will not find a legislator, a representative, a senator in this country who would say on the record, the way that we do childcare is great. Instead, what they'll say is maybe she shouldn't go to work, which is an admission that the current system is broken, that you're basically telling people that the only solution I have for you is to opt out of it. That's not the same thing, right? That's not that the system works well. It's that I don't want to fix it, so don't use the system. Those are not the same statements. The other thing that is happening is that childcare sits at the nexus of two policies. One is that it generates a lot more workers and income, and two, it tends to generate a lot more children. People will cite the inability to afford childcare as one of the number one, if not the number one reason why they don't have another kid, or why they space their kids apart, where you're starting to see that siblings are, rather than have all your kids close together, you have your kids 5 to 6 years apart because you can't afford 2 kids in care at the same time. The cost of childcare is warping families in the United States. So why don't we have it? Well, in some level, there has been childcare in European countries, 2 to 3 decades longer than we've not had it, because they made a lot of these moves in the 90s. And it wasn't because they're like proto-feminist. It wasn't because they care about children more than we do. They just saw the writing on the wall. They needed more workers and they needed more children, and childcare could help with both. And some of the biggest social policy wins that feminists advocate for in the US were the product of conservative movements in other countries. I mean, you have countries like France that say, the conservatives said, if we want women to stay at home, we should fund the first 6 months, because once they're there, they're not going to want to go back to work. And so we should have really generous family leave to try to basically get women to stay at home. Whereas in the US, it's presented as we should have family leave because then people keep earnings and then they'll want to go, and then it makes it easier to go back to work as opposed to quit. None of these policies have a rule over where they come from in terms of political movements, or what makes them palpable to populations of who becomes their champion. What I think about is, what is their economic role? What is the economic necessity? And that just gives me a way to talk about it that kind of supersedes all these other things and say, look, the reality of the situation is we need childcare. It's an economic necessity. It is a boon to families in so many countless ways. It's a boon to local economies. It helps public school systems. This is the best economic investment we don't make. The optimism for me there is saying things like, and we've never tried really anything. So only up to go from here. Nice.
So I'm ADHD, right? So I need to let you know that. I had this whole list of questions about stablecoin and relaying it. It's basically just my rant about going back to company script for coal miners. And I want you to talk about that, but I don't right now, because I want to stay where we are here because I love it so much. You talked about work versus productivity. How when we retire, have a child or something like that. When does our economy actually value work, or is it just value productivity? Or does that make any sense to you? And
I mean, I don't know if I understand the question.
Yeah, that's probably fair.
Productivity. So this is economists have their own language, and productivity means something very specific to us, which is it is the output per hour of a worker. So it's just taking the entire size of the U.S. economy and dividing it by the number of workers, and then dividing it by the number of hours they worked. And we have this, for us, productivity is an expression of the size of the economy relative to the number of people working. So it's a very different I don't think America likes workers very much, in that we don't.
That seems
historically true.
Yeah.
But I think that, how do I say this?
Well, so I'm thinking about retirement and options available to people.
Okay.
retirement is, I hear all these things like most U.S. workers don't have enough for retirement. Social Security was never meant to be your whole retirement because you only were going to live for like 2 or 3 more years or whatever. So people that, when you lose your job or the retirement security doesn't cover your work, or doesn't cover your needs, like that's what I think sort of, and then I'm just yelling at Reagan in my head right now. I'm not really sure if I explain myself. Sort of like we just need you to keep making things. The value of your work is not really the important part. Like we just need you to keep working. If that makes sense. Like I need you to keep producing rather than having like purpose and meaning, or not even purpose or meaning, but just having meaningful work, if that makes sense.
Well, okay, so I think,
and I may be using language.
Well, so I think it's really interesting in the U.S. that we have a very unsympathetic, caustic view of people who don't have a job.
Yes.
If they're under 65. If they're over 65 and they don't have a job, we've kind of given this grace period of like, we like retirement in the U.S., but we very much think it should be only for the people who have worked hard enough to earn it. And if you've worked hard enough to earn it, it's because then you have the retirement savings account to show for it. And to me, it's all kind of symptoms of the same feature, which is both like one of our strengths and weaknesses, which is that we're a very individually minded country. We have a people that like value, kind of see their own contributions. And it is hard. It is really hard to admit just how vulnerable you are in the economy. So if someone becomes unemployed, they just won't take work. They're not looking hard enough. They didn't work that great. They didn't pick the right employer. I mean, we want to blame people for being in a bad economic situation because if it wasn't their fault, it could happen to us too. Mm-hmm. Like it's hard for me to grasp as a person in the economy that you could work really hard, make good choices, go to the right school or go to the right trade school, get a good job with an employer, show up on time, save the 10% that you're supposed to. And then at the end of the day, you'd get fired for no reason. I mean, the idea of the randomness of economic risk is very hard for Americans to stomach. And so it's a lot easier to say those people did something wrong. And those people didn't work. So same thing with retirement savings. I put into my 401k. I saved. I put money into an IRA. So if I make it to retirement, I've done the right things, even though what we have learned over the past 30 years of 401ks is that a fraction of people will contribute to a 401k if it's voluntary. It's like 25 to 35%, but 90 plus will if it's an auto enrollment. We start contributing and don't even let you know, and then you can opt out if you want to. So I think Americans take a lot of pride and place in their own accomplishments, which is good, but that can lend them a blind spot to how much at risk they are simply being in the economy. And so this can lead to a really judgmental place of like, well, they don't have a job because they didn't work hard enough, and they don't have retirement savings because they're not financially literate. And actually grappling with the institutions that kind of influence economic outcomes is harder to, I think, handle. And nobody wants to say like, yeah, luck, just luck.
Look, yeah, I was thinking about, as you were talking about that, I was thinking about I have a younger sister, and my judging her choices in the times where the company she worked for laid off or closed, and I'm like, why aren't you have another job? And this is like sort of. And also in our work here in my work, I worked with houseless people since I was like 10 years old. Like I've been hanging around with those folks and I have like a ton of grace and care and like understanding for them about how they get into their situations and how they get stuck and can't get out. And just interesting to me as you're talking, my own reflection in my head about, I do that. Like I have these judgmental ideas about, hey, why aren't you doing this differently or better? Or what's wrong with you? which
But
I need to talk to my therapist about. But
I think it's really, it's very hard not to be judgmental because it's a form of self-preservation. Like I make good choices. I do good things. I'm proud of myself. And I wouldn't want to know that it actually is less in my control than I realize. And I think that's what makes things like as a recession coming kind of scary, because that's when we associate even people who have done good things having bad things happen. It's like we've localized this risk to just certain periods in our economy as opposed to it being an all the time risk. There's this really great book that came out in 1930 called Some Folks Won't Work. And in the 1920s, which we describe the 1920s as roaring, it was really not a good economic period, but the U.S. had no count of unemployment. And a set of social workers who worked at settlement houses did 300 case studies of workers throughout the U.S. to have them just explain, like, you don't have money now. What happened between your job and like destitution? And it's basically these workers saying, they lost a shift, they lost this, they couldn't find a job, they went to this place. And the whole point of the book was just trying to convince people that even if the economy was good, people could be struggling with unemployment. They collected all the stories between 27 and I think 26 and 28. And then they were writing the book, but by the time it published, it came out like 2 months after the crash. And it ended up being really formative in thinking of like how we should help people who have become unemployed. But they say it like the very front of the book. It was written by a journalist at the time named Clinch Calkins. But she says like in the prologue, like, you think if people don't have a job, it's just because they're lazy and you need to be convinced otherwise. But she kind of says like, but really this depression has done my work for me, because now you see that the economy can be bad. But the book was meant to point out that it can be tough in the economy, even when it doesn't seemingly seem like it's not seemingly anything wrong with it.
Yeah, I love. I was going to say I love the depression, but that's a bad sentence. But just like the idea of like the breadlines and the like Tennessee Valley Authority and the Conservation Corps and all of these like sort of governmental, strong central government things that were designed for workers to get them to work and the infrastructure that was built because of that. Now, whether or not we should have been building more railroads or more highways is a different conversation. But like those, like the way the government supported, when it was everybody, or it seemed like everybody.
But what's interesting about it is to kind of, this is me deliberately echoing what I said before. I mean, Hoover was president when the Great Depression started, and the crash of 29 is not as I think acute as people realize, in the sense that there were troubles in the economy for months before, and the crash was severe, but it was not a one and done, like we were great, things were bad, and then FDR came. In fact, the worst part of the Great Depression came in 1931, where we had already been in decline for a couple years when the unemployment situation got worse. Over the first 4 years of the crisis, we had a Republican president who did not believe in government intervention and who thought that the more the government intervened, the worse the economy would be. And he tried almost everything else. Like he tried to get people to get into a compact to say that they wouldn't cut wages. He leaned on rich people and told them they needed to help out in their communities. He tried to get private, kind of like families help each other out. He tried to do something called work share, where he would convince employers that they needed to cut time of their current workforce in half so then they could employ other people half time. I mean, he was trying to do things that weren't big federal government intervention. And by the time you got to 1932, it was like, okay, and now we need to do something else. I think that there's echoes in our economy in so many time periods of a similar, like, we have the same problem that we've approached in multiple ways. You don't like the next way that's coming because you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, but like, it is time to move on and try the next thing. People tend to erase just how long Hoover was in office, leading us, really, the guy should have been amazing in office and he was not. Like in another era, Hoover would have been one of the best presidents we've ever had. he was like a total self-made millionaire, like orphan becomes genius engineer, absolute technocrat, but like he just did not have the ability to make the big government work because he just didn't believe in it. So in another era, he would have been amazing. But like time to move on to the next person or the next idea or the next solution. And I think a lot of people feel on the economy right now, this like there's like a growing urgency of like, can we move on? Like, I can't afford housing. I can't afford childcare. I can't afford utilities. I don't make enough money. I can't afford healthcare, and my parents are dying. So not only can I not afford these things, I basically can't even afford to have a job anymore. Like, is there something else we can do? This is where I say, yeah, there's so much we can do.
Right. There's so much we have. They have this whole bag of things over here that we've never even looked at. It's that like box that's in your closet that you forgot about that has all kinds of cool stuff.
Well, states and localities have experimented with most of the things that we would like to do, that I would like to do on the federal level for economic policy. The big difference between the federal government and state and local governments in addressing a problem is that the federal government has money.
Yeah.
I mean, really, they're just there to write the check. And we need them to. So
So I think this goes to my next question, because I think it points to sort of talking about, like, I feel like Herbert Hoover may have been like the first I built this. I remember like a few years ago, like I think Elizabeth Warren, I remember her like sort of pushing back on the I built this Republican independent self-made kind of thing, which it's just, if you pay attention at all, that's a lie. Like we talk about like in our community, it's sort of like we're all part of it, and we all have like I rely on Chris. Like we couldn't have this conversation. You and I couldn't have this conversation if I didn't have like 3 other people who knew what they were doing and like could make sure it all set up, and I just get to hold the microphone. So like that's fun for me. So who, like, you've talked a lot about the economic data that is misses certain people. So as we start thinking about like we hold up into like pedestals, like the Elon Musks, the Jeff Bezos, like rich people, as some sort of bastion of knowledge or wisdom or I don't know, superiority. And you talk about like women and low-income workers and older people who get miscounted or not counted as part of economic health. What does it mean for that our whole picture of how we're doing is built around gaps that like especially people in the margins and women and older folks and stuff like that?
Not counted how?
Well, so you talked about like you've talked about like the and maybe I'm misunderstanding or I don't know, not being articulate enough. When you're measuring economic health, how are we doing that, and does that take into account all parties? Like okay. So you talked about like so like the childcare issue, and it could be if we like had universal childcare or something, then it would actually increase work or I don't know, be helpful for the economy and the majority of people.
So I think the way that I think what you're talking about, and I'll try both.
Yeah, sure.
Why not?
Sure.
Porque los dos. So I think one aspect that I get at is that most people view the like merit or value of an economic investment as whether or not it flows through them. So, I don't have kids. We shouldn't have childcare in the U.S. And when you phrase it like that, it's like, Jesus, man, like come on, like that's pretty arrogant. Yeah, like there could be a benefit to childcare even if you don't have children. But a lot of people will say, like, why should I pay for somebody else's kids? Like, if I got a job without the government helping me, why do I need to have my tax dollars have the government help you to get a job? And so I think that there's an aspect to which so many of the investments we need to make in our country will flow through populations that the U.S. has historically not liked. Like, it's very hard to build a childcare system that is good and generous and excludes single mothers. We don't like single moms. We never have, especially if they're Black and low income. Like, that is the worst combination that you can be in our economy and society. But in order to withhold investments from that group, we have hurt a lot of other groups in the process. And so the idea that I try to stress is that it's going to be the case that there's someone who you don't like in the economy that's going to get money, or they're going to get childcare, or their kid's going to get a free lunch, or they're going to get a cash benefit to keep their child out of poverty. You need to get on board with economic investments coming from groups of people that you don't like. Believe it or not, lots of liberal people would say that a lot of investment goes through corporations and they don't like them much, but it's not a... we can't just starve one part of the economy and have the other flourish like this. We're all interconnected in our economy and in our labor market. So I talk a lot about that, and I try to be, I don't know, sometimes I can be really like olive branch gracious, like, I would love to talk to you about this. And other times I'm just like really acerbic, and I'm just like, listen, I get it. You pay taxes. You're better than all of us. Congratulations.
Right.
We're going to send you a t-shirt.
Right.
I'm better than you because I pay more in taxes. And then like whenever your town throws a parade, we can then have childcare once you feel like we've respected you for being better enough. Like I can go back and forth. It kind of depends on the mood in the audience of how I'm feeling.
I like that. I feel like I heard like someone suggested a billionaire tax where if you make more than $1 billion, everything more than that is taxed at 100%. And you get like a certificate, like you won life. Or
yeah,
something.
you won life. Great job. I mean, I don't. The thing is that the stuff like that, I'm like, we don't need that. Like, y'all, we have a really good income tax base that we all contribute to. Like, we don't need to live off of the generosity or soaking billionaires. Like, our economy isn't that unstable, and neither is our tax system. We do need to stop cutting taxes and raise them back to reasonable rates, but raise them back to rates that they were in like the year 2000. Like, we don't need to build our entire social welfare system off of like soaking billionaires. Like it's not necessary. I don't want to make them that important.
Yeah. I think, yeah, Warren, sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
But I will say I have had a policy proposal that I've talked about in many areas, which is that I do think we should tax people more when they're dead. And that we need an estate tax so that if you die with more than $5 million in an estate, it starts to get taxed, and that's deposited into a children's trust fund. So like, yes, your children will inherit all of the riches of the earth. However, the government's going to skim off the top for people who don't have the luxury of rich parents. And I've talked about that. I mean, I don't think taxing active billionaires we'll only have more of them as inflation grows. So I think it's like not, for me, it's just, I have really progressive policies, but it doesn't translate there. I'm more of if you die with a lot of wealth, you need to give some back to children whose parents have nothing. And that's just fair. And it's not about punishing you for being successful. It's really about punishing your children and not giving them too much of an advantage. And if there's one group that should not be sympathetic, it's rich people's kids.
Yeah.
But,
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I joke that it's Bezos. I mean, Bezos Jr., right, doesn't need all that money. He needs to give a little bit back to other kids. But the other part you were talking about, I think, was about measurement and gaps, is that our economy does not, the way that we measure the size of our economy becomes a de facto measurement of the health of our economy, and it has no accounting for quality of life. And the person who invented our economy's measurement, which is gross domestic product, he said in the 30s when he submitted it to Congress, like, don't rely too much on this because it's not, he's like, it's an accounting feature. This is not good. This will tell you how much the U.S. can spend in World War II production without breaking the economy wide open again. But this is not a measure of quality of life, and you shouldn't put too much of an emphasis on it. Was like the first paragraph he sent as he proposed GDP to Congress. So
redacted.
Yeah. I mean, but I think even people who do rely on GDP tell you it's not a measure of quality. It's just, it happens to be really important because of how much it tends to predict when it declines. So, I mean, the economy is not, the economy and our understanding of it, and our measurement of it, and our evaluation of it, they're all far from perfect. I think sometimes people like to hold it up as like the smoking gun. Like, did you know stay-at-home moms aren't even counted in GDP, and therefore it's terrible? Or did you know, but if you raise the minimum wage, a restaurant is going to go out of business because it's too expensive now? And that you come up with some problem, and that's almost like, and that's veto worthy. Of, oh, I found a problem with the policy, or I found a problem with the measurement, and therefore the entire thing's a lie. When really it's just about being able to put them all together for the whole picture. I think that if you passed a law to require paid sick leave for every worker in the United States and gave them workplace protection so that they can't be fired for missing a shift or being sick, I think it's likely the case that some businesses would find that to be too much and close, that some businesses might not hire as many people, and that some workers might take advantage of it. And yet here I am unmoved, still thinking that we should have sick days for every workers and err on the side of someone shirks or it's too much, as opposed to err on the side of 30 million people don't deserve an hour time off.
Yeah, I love that. So I feel like that's a segue into this. I want to sort of dip a little bit into theology, which is more my sort of space. So I have a congregation member who says that they hear about, like, we talk about justice, and like we're involved with the Poor People's Campaign and various other economic opportunities for people to be positive in their with their money. So if someone says, I want to engage with money in a way that reflects what I actually believe, what would sound economic advice look like? Not like prosperity gospel, money is inherently evil. Like the sort of like if somebody wants to sort of like invest or use their money in that reflects their values, how might one do that?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't get asked this a lot. No one would ask an economist for how to pursue good values. That's our joke, right? We know the price of everything and the value of nothing.
No, this is why I want to ask you.
Oh, that's fascinating. I mean, I don't know. I think at my core, as a person, right, you want to live your life from an empathetic place, right? To do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and thinking about how you interact with people in your life, through the lens of money. Like, I don't know, do you tip well? You should. I mean, it's a really small thing, but like, you should probably tip. You should probably be the person that tells someone's manager they did a good job. You can be, I think you can do more just as an agent in the economy than you probably realize. That would be one translation or one interpretation of doing unto others is like, you don't want to be the jerk customer. Mm-hmm. You don't want to be the one that complains, that treats workers like garbage. And I mean, I don't know. This is like maybe too much personal information about me. I think I'm the person that goes to the manager and I'm like, you are not giving them a good shift. This is terrible. Like I had my child at a daycare very briefly. I had 4 days of daycare before the pandemic hit with my first kid. And then I was alone at home again with a baby for another year because we couldn't find childcare in the pandemic. And I just remember that I walked into the classroom and was dropping off an infant, and there were 7 babies on the floor and 1 person in the room. And I was bringing in number 8. Well, that's against the ratio of the workplace and for child safety. And I stayed in the room, and I just stood there, and I was like, you need to get somebody else. Like, I'm not leaving 8 babies with 1 person. Like, you need to get someone else in this room. And I made like a big stink about it. And finally they got someone else. They pulled them from another classroom. And then when they were there, I left. And when I came back at the end of the day, someone who I'd never met before, who had just started in my kid's classroom, came up and was like, I need to apologize to you because I was late for work and I got stuck in traffic. And like, I didn't know how long it would take. And, it was just recounting this apology to me. And I looked at her and I was like, please stop. And I was like, I don't care. And then I walked down to the office of the director who ran the daycare. And I mean, I unloaded on her. And I was like, how dare you? How dare you make some hourly worker who I'm sure doesn't make a lot of money apologize for me that you don't staff at the right levels to take into account backup care? I do not think this is her fault. This is your fault. You are in charge. I'm not like proud of this moment of like, this is something that you should or something I didn't, but like, it's hard leaving your kid behind at daycare for the first time. And I basically learned in the course of 4 days, I did not trust these people, in part because I felt like this person who ran the daycare was so like cheap and mean. And had her workers apologize to me for management issues, how would you react in that type of situation? I'm not proud of my reaction. I have a temper, and I don't have the greatest patience for throwing low-wage workers under the bus in front of me. And I don't mean that in a self-righteous way. I mean that, like, I really should not stick my nose in this business. But I think that, we are so programmed to despise poor people, to despise low-wage people, to assume that someone who doesn't make so much money, someone who works at a job that you don't respect, that they therefore don't have any worth. And when you start to pull back the programming and think truly about the person that you're looking at, you would be surprised how casually we denigrate 25% of workers in the U.S. We call them unskilled.
Yeah.
We say that they're low skilled workers. They're unskilled workers. We will drive right past a picket line to go get our Starbucks because even though they're organizing, I need it. We're very much dismissive of people based on where they ended up on the rungs of the economic ladder. That moment with my putting a baby on the floor and having some hourly worker have to apologize to me was just one of these moments in life where I could see my viewpoint just like breaking and turning the other direction of how many times in my life a manager has thrown up one of their low-paid staff as like the reason for my problem, as opposed to the manager or the company or the owner or something like that. Living with economic justice in a capitalist world is not an easy task, but it does start with some level of understanding the lack of respect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's I love that. I want to give a shout out to Ashley, who works here. She used to work at Starbucks, and it was the only union Starbucks in our town. We had there was like a group of people that would only go to that Starbucks. So I'm a big fan. But so here's a question. Sort of like getting near the end. What would an economy that took human dignity seriously as an actual design look like?
I mean, depends on how we did it.
Right, obviously, but like if you were to sort of bake into the structure human dignity into our economy, like what would that look like, or what are we missing, or is feasible?
It's funny because I think I could imagine a very conservative person saying that there's, kind of like clipping Reagan and saying that there's a dignity to work and there's a dignity to making it on your own, and that there's an indignity to government benefits or government intervention, and that it's not a definition that I would agree with, but a lot of people tell you that their version of dignity is already at hand. Mm-hmm. And that this is a loaded question. Have you ever heard of the brown paper bag when it comes to school lunch?
No.
Yeah.
Maybe. This
one is like, it's one of the more like satisfying fact checks you'll ever have. Ooh, but it involves Paul Ryan, Ooh. Who was the erstwhile congressional representative for Janesville, Wisconsin, and then one-time Speaker of the House and vice presidential nominee.
Famous for doing curls, like have a photo in one of his campaign ads with like doing curls or something. I
do remember I worked in D.C. at the time, and I remember distinctly when I think it was Politico broke that he had lied about his marathon time by an hour, which is like, that's just such a politician thing to do. Yes. I'm like, that is like, I've learned more about that guy's personality, not like his flaws as a leader, but just his personality. He recites, it might be easier to say this like front to back instead of back to front, but basically, a woman had wrote a memoir about adopting a kid who was homeless on the street. And through the retelling of her, through like press junkets, like proposing the book and selling it, and it getting through word of mouth from like people who actually work in state government, it ended with Paul Ryan saying on the national stage that children shouldn't have free school lunch because it robs them of the dignity of having their parent take care of them. And that they didn't want to, like, they didn't want a tray from the cafeteria. They wanted a paper bag like everybody else. And that the school lunch, hurts children. They'd be better off like not, it's a really wild story.
In the 80s, so I went to elementary school in the 80s, and when I was in Georgia, everybody had school lunch. Like you got I don't ever remember bringing $1 to school, right? And then I moved to Texas in my sixth grade, and you had to pay for your lunch. And then I started bringing my lunch.
So always the case with school lunch.
I was 8,
we have free and reduced school lunch in the U.S., which is if you have a low enough income, you can get lunch for free. But most schools that offer free and reduced lunch also offer lunch for purchase for anybody else. And how they do it, of like how you are billed, if you bring in lunch every day, if you're just billed at the end of the month, has always varied a ton. But we have also had community eligibility programs where if enough students are eligible for free and reduced lunch, they just give it to the whole school. And it used to be that number was really high, that it had to be as many as like 90% or 95%. And now through the Obama administration, that threshold was lowered like down to 40. And now it was such a broad movement of success that schools loved giving everybody lunch, and school lunch is a really easy way to buy higher test scores because hungry kids don't do well in school, that now states are chipping in to try and make universal school meals something that every kid has at least 2 meals a day at school, because it does so much for like behavioral issues, disciplinary issues. They do better in school, they do better on exams, they're healthier. So school lunch is great. But in the midst of this debate, Paul Ryan brought up a really like amped up anecdote of how the problem with school lunch is that it robs some kids of the love of a parent sending them with a paper bag.
That makes me so angry. Like
it's hilarious because it's so. I mean. And I think the part that is probably the most ironic to me is that if you go down to the actual story of what a little black kid said to a rich white woman who offered to pay him for his lunch, was not that he didn't want a free lunch, was that he wanted his mother to love him. Right? This kid was abandoned, and he said he got jealous that other kids had their parents pack them lunch, and they're like, yeah, so that's why we shouldn't have school lunch. And it's like, man, that is not even close to the lesson that needs to come from this.
Oh my gosh, there's a dramatic, like, wholesale missing of the point. Like
it's a very dramatic wholesale missing of the point, and like co-opting the story of a little black boy in order to say that we shouldn't have investments in children writ large. So dignity is a very nebulous term.
Sure.
I think that's a sidebar conversation about that. What I stress when I think about human dignity is, I do not believe children should have to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. I just
that you are holding.
This is in America. We like to be self-made. We like to earn our place and say that we made it, but you can't really say that so long as you are taking advantage of the fact that some children can't afford food and you're in competition with them. And I've always thought that it's the thing we don't say out loud is that almost any of the like broad investments you could make in children would leave one group of kids worse off. And it's the richest kids, because now they're actually competing with people. And there is a protective aspect to having lots of poor children if you are not a poor child. Because you can do better than them on tests, and you can do better than them in sports, and you can do better than them because you have dental care and health care and food, and your parents will pay hundreds of dollars for you to get tutors. And the more that you bring up the bottom, the harder it is for the top to pull away. I don't think that people should have an advantage in life to other people having very poor parents. So that to me is where the level of dignity is probably the biggest gaping hole we have in the US economy, is just how much of an advantage your parents' income gets you, even by kindergarten. So that I'm like, kids need universal investments, like Medicaid eligibility for all children. We're almost there anyway. Universal school meals for all kids, a child cash benefit, so they'll all have a basic standard of living, universal child care and early education, a quintupling on the amount of money we spend on development and, learning disability issues, like just really move it there. But when
fully
you come
funding public education.
Yeah, funding public education. But when you become an adult, I think it's a dignity is a very different measure. And what we are lacking for a lot of adults in our society is just an understanding that there is risk that can befall them. And we need a better, basically, insurance system for when things happen. We have disability insurance. We have old age insurance through Social Security. We have a terrible unemployment insurance program that doesn't serve enough people. But all of these are called insurance because they're built off of the notion not that you deserve a handout, but that you deserve to have some type of protection for the naturally risky endeavor you are embarking on, which is being a person in our economy. And so I'm very much on I'm an insurance girly, as some would say, which is that I think that if you have a well-designed social insurance program for certain economic risk, it really obviates the need to have things like a ton of people on food stamps, because you've built risk management into the system. Right now, it's very much like you're on your own, just dump people off of a cliff and see what happens. I don't know if I can talk more about that. It's a really broad agenda.
Yeah, no, I was thinking as you were talking about that, the universal basic income idea, but like it doesn't work for me. I don't, as I understand it very limitedly, it doesn't work unless you have those other insurances, so like universal health care and other sort of things in place not for adults, because like and the universal basic income takes out the need for things like WIC and SNAP and those kinds of things. But then you have these other placeholders that help people. The thing I was thinking about as you were talking was, in the Bible, in the Old Testament especially, they talk about Jesus talks about economy more than money, more than anything else. He doesn't ever talk about gays, so we don't either. But they had this year of Jubilee and debt forgiveness and those kinds of stuff. And Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, who is over at the Caros Center, she talks about, she wrote a book called Always With Us, What Jesus Said About the Poor. And she said those systems were designed, not that there wasn't a difference between top and bottom, but that the separation between top and bottom didn't get so out of touch. So that the people who were on the higher earners, or landowners, those kinds of stuff, weren't so far away from the servants, shepherds, those kinds of folks, that they didn't have some understanding or empathy or sympathy for them, which I think is an interesting thing. I think about socialism, I describe it as having a floor but no ceiling. And so how do we figure out how to create that floor I love your ideas about the different sort of really taking care of kids. I think ends up taking care of adults anyway, but that's a...
Well, we could always try. I mean, that's the thing, right? Like, well, we've never really tried to have equal childhoods for children. And we've never given them a floor that meant anything, because sometimes we just really dislike their parents. And we'd rather punish the kid than reward the parent. So, I'm...
As a soccer dad, I'm a big fan of punishing other parents for the way that they treat their children. But anyway, sorry.
But, I think...
Also, as a foster parent, so Paul Ryan's sort of take was just triggering. I know it's the wrong word, but I was assuming that kids have parents is a whole thing. Anyway, sorry.
Oh yeah, this to me is the real economic dignity and justice is just like walking away from the assumptions that you have about people in our economy. When you look at economically secure people and economically insecure people, there's really two lotteries that you have to win. One, that your parents have money, and two, that your parents accept you. And there's lots of reasons why you're going to lose one or both. Mm-hmm. But you have I mean, you have people in queer communities and trans communities where their parents won't speak to them. And they're living in a world where it's stacked so much in favor of getting help from your family to go to college, to write your essays, to get tutorials, to get that apartment. They help you with first and last month rent. They help you with something like 1 in 4 households, people get a gift for the down payment. Mm-hmm. I mean, we accrue so much economic advantage from having a family that accepts us and has money to invest in us. And part of our dignity and empathy has to start with understanding the many reasons why someone would not have that and how it could disadvantage them.
Yeah, that's in the church I serve. We talk about our language is we are a full inclusion community of ordinary people experiencing and embodying God's extraordinary love. So that incorporates sort of all identities and expressions and all this kinds of stuff. One of my sort of like unicorn Pollyanna things that I wanted to do as a foster parent was to foster kids who are about to age out. Because my wife and I have been blessed with all 4 of our parents are still here. They're all together. We sort of got lucky, and have used that to try to do our best, and help others, but be able to be those people that help with the essays, to help with the FAFSA, to take the college tours, to have access to find out the access to the different programs that are available for foster kids. That was my dream. And then I got into the program and I was like, oh, I see it's not nearly as organized. But it makes sense. So I have one last question for you. And this has been so much fun. I mean, I just sit I watch your 10-minute long TikToks. I could just sort of sit and love it. Cause I feel like you do such a great job, of explaining, and I feel like your passion comes through, which one of my favorite things in the world is watching people do something that they're passionate about. And so I really appreciate that. I really appreciate your work and your voice in my feed and then as throughout the country. So I hope more people take your view of a little bit more wider, maybe take a step back, take a little bit of wider perspective, and then also say well, we haven't tried that. Let's try it now. We've never done that before, is a killer for churches and other organizations. So we try to stay away from that thing. So here's my last question. What is a question you're sitting with right now that you don't have an answer to yet?
Well, okay, I have a policy question that I don't know the answer to yet,
sure.
Which is how we get universal health care. It is not, I have an idea, but it's of all the things that I can talk about in terms of how to have a better economy, this one is tough. Mm-hmm. And it's something that I'm always reading about and thinking about and talking to people. So I have a book deal and I'm writing a book.
Ooh, that's exciting.
And it'll be about all of these things, basically how the economy can be awesome.
When do you have a release date? Or
it won't be for a while because it takes. Okay. I didn't realize this. Once you finish a draft, the book doesn't come out for at least another year. Oh. So it'll be at least another year and then some. But because I don't know what universal healthcare should look like in America, I'm convening a conference of people, all health experts, so that I can ask them. And it's something that I have to learn about because health is something it's pretty far from where I consider to be my trained practitioner expertise. So how to get to universal health care, what Americans really want on health care. And to me, that one's a tough one because we like private health care. I mean, we like that nice big room. We like having a room to ourselves. We like being able to order whatever health care we want whenever we get sick. It's a two-way street of we don't have a good healthcare system and we're not necessarily great healthcare users.
Sure.
A doctor tells us no and we're great, I'm going to another doctor. It's kind of an interesting fit. I've been trying to conceptualize what is the most American version of universal health insurance. That's good. That's a question I don't know the answer to. I think the other question I don't know the answer to is what will be the catalyst for what comes next? What comes next, I think there's an obviousness to it. I saw a proposal come out from a relatively centrist to conservative think tank about Social Security that was trying to build off of the populism that is kind of in the air right now, but use it to like cut benefits. And it's a pretty underhanded marketing campaign they put together of like, there's people who get so much money from Social Security benefits, like they're rich billionaires, so we need to cut benefits for like the top 30% of people. And like, it was I thought, very disingenuous proposal, but it was very indicative to me of just how much people are disgusted with the distribution of our economy. Of just how much people hate that you have these people like Bezos and Musk and Zuckerberg, and they wield incredible influence, and our lives are hard. There is a growing disgust, and it's palpable in the air when people talk about it. What I don't know is like, what does turning look like? What is that moment that turns us to, and now we're going to do something else? Is it an election? Is it a catastrophe? Is it a scandal? I think about this of like, what would be the actual moment that inspires us to do something different? And we've lived through a lot of crucible moments of the last 5 years. And I think it's definitely building. We always present history as such harsh turns and sharp turns, when really it's changes that we just see some kind of high watermark for. And so I can feel like the mood in the air, and I can feel that the tide is shifting, and people don't want what we have now, and they're looking for something different. But I do wonder what that moment will be, and if we'll see it when it comes.
Yeah, we just actually were talking about this here about like the civil rights movement. We were with Bloody Sunday, specifically with the March at Selma, how we see that, like we look back on that and we see this, oh, that was the turning point, or Rosa Parks, or the I Have a Dream speech, or whatever. Like, but just the fact that I named 3 of those things means that they weren't, like, so you look at like Rodney King, or you look at Leo Mangione, or Alex Preddy, or Nicole Good, like all these people that have these like moments, or Black Lives Matter movement, like all these things that were George Floyd, like these things that I felt like were like, oh, now it's going to turn, and it didn't, or it didn't turn that much, or we sunk back, or, yeah. So I mean, I think that's a great question. I'm interested to see what that looks like. And then what do you think is the obvious turn?
Well, the obvious turn for social and economic policy is a horrible recession. That is the obvious turn. I just don't want that one to happen. Mm-hmm. A lot of the New Deal that came out of the Great Depression, I think people think like, oh, the Depression was bad enough, so we got to have social policy, when really those policies were 3 to 4 decades. Everything he did while, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Social Security Act, the National Labor Relations Act, those ideas, maybe not NLRA, arguably, but those ideas were like 3 or 4 decades old. I mean, they had been building in momentum, and then they finally got a seat at the table in terms of power, and they willed those reforms through Congress, watered down, not as strong as they wanted, but they got them. I think people have put a little bit too much credit on the Great Depression as like, if the economy is bad enough, we'll induce some change. But that said, I do think if the economy is bad enough, we might induce some change. I just hope it doesn't come to that. I do think that our birth rates are starting to really scare people. Mm-hmm. And we're about to find out. I'm 40. I'm on the elder millennial. I'm like one of the oldest millennials. We're about to get a large cohort who are going to age out of childbearing. 40 to 44 is when we take your lifetime completed fertility for women. And I think that if that falls, that is really going to start to freak some people out, that we truly, like, we are a country that is so dysfunctional, people don't want to have children. And that might be a big catalyst moment. Yeah, but I do worry that it'll take, or we just like have some political candidate that we fall in love with. One of my friends is a presidential historian, and she will say like unequivocally, America loves falling in love with the president. Like it is something that no other country loves their president the way that we do. We are very idealistic people. And we want to be inspired, and we want to see magic in the air. And those are the presidents that we will also love the most through time. Is we will just give them a larger than life mythology because we love our leaders. I was talking to my friend who was British about Keir Starmer. I don't remember what his first name is, and I was like, the way that I phrased it to him is I was like, okay, so America, we often fall in love with presidents, but like it's as a rule, everyone hates the mayor of New York. And he was like, sure. I was like, it's just like, nobody likes the mayor of New York. It's part of being a New Yorker. I was like, so where does England lie? And he's like, oh yeah, nobody likes we never like them. Like they're not like us. They don't have this idealist that will change their mind on so many things. And so I'm kind of curious as to how those things will come together. Just the exigencies of the cost of our current inequality and system, the cataclysm it can bring, and the hope that springs from it. Something's got to combine. I just don't know what.
Awesome. I just thought of one more question.
Okay.
What's something that you're reading or watching or listening to that you think other people should be reading, watching, or listening to?
Oh my God.
Other than the optimistic.
Well, sure.
Podcast.
My podcast and my column. Thank you. Also my Substack.
Yes.
My written words. What is something that people should be reading? Maybe
that you just like, you don't even care if anybody else likes it.
I tend to read these like really big nonfiction history books, economic policy books, and I would not necessarily like force that on other people. I do think that if you've never read about Frances Perkins, her biography is The Woman Behind the New Deal. It is really fascinating. And I think if she weren't a woman, she would be one of the most famous Americans that have ever lived. There's no other reason why she is not more famous. Like she's like the Thomas Paine. These just like private citizens that have absolutely changed the fate of our country. She is in the top 3, but we don't really talk about her. And her biography.
Never heard her name before.
Frances Perkins was FDR's labor secretary. She oversaw the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Social Security Act, probably the 2 most pivotal pieces of legislation in our social welfare history. And she brought them to him. He asked her to be Secretary of Labor, and she was like, I'm only doing it if I can get this stuff. And he was like, okay. And so we kind of credit FDR with being this like New Deal savant, but really she brought it all to him, or at least the parts that we really like. So I would read Perkins's biography. She got like a really fascinating, sad life, with a lot of accomplishments and pain in there. So people who are truly human, even as they contribute to the world, I always find that to be really appealing and fascinating. There's a book that I recommend to almost anyone, called There Goes My Everything. And it's a history of white people during the civil rights movement. And it's really fascinating on so many levels, but it kind of illustrates, using the white people during the civil rights movement in the South, it really illustrates just how contradictory are the views that people hold. And that the like radicalism of the civil rights movement for white people in the South was very much a function of the fact that it took them by surprise, that they had lived with this like very incorrect, but very like deep in their mind reality that like black people were happy with the way things were, and that they understood black people the way that Northerners didn't, and that everyone was happy with the state of affairs. And it was very hard for them to come up. This is why like they didn't lower the flag at half mast when MLK was shot over his native state of Georgia, because the governor said, we don't lower the flag for communist. Like it made more sense for white people in the South to think that the civil rights movement were agitators from northern counties that were communists than to believe that people that lived alongside them felt oppressed. And I think that we often paint with too broad of a brush, but it is a really fascinating kind of portrayal that makes you wonder, like, what are the inconsistencies that I have? It also makes clear how much, and I think it, like, I wish everyone in America had read this in 2020 during the George Floyd summer, but it also makes clear just how much that your acceptance of other people comes from not having to interact with them. And they do a couple really great studies, not studies, but like chapters on school integration. And they use Atlanta as a case study. And like the white people who were in favor of school integration didn't live anywhere near black people. And they were like, yeah, integrate. We should integrate schools. That's so good. But like they're nowhere near there. It was the white people who were really like in border neighborhoods that were going to be integrated with, black schools that were poorer than them, that had a lot fewer resources. They were the ones that were like kind of at the forefront of integration. And like their journey is very different than like the journey of the white people that were basically unaffected by everything that happened. And so that I find their stories to be just so, insightful is the wrong word. I think it opens up just how people view things. And it really takes the notion of perspective and experience for something as fundamental as are these two races equal? And it makes that answer like very, very textured. And I think that you'll have those people who are like, I don't see color. And that's harmful, right? Like it's how you see color and what informs how you see color that is the more interesting question. And I think this book does a really good job of just like peeling back the various views people have. And I think some of my favorite stories of the book were the people who were so racist, so opposed to integration, and then it starts to affect them. Like the white people on the other side of town say we should close schools so that we don't have to go to school with black children, but like not their schools. And, when you're a stay-at-home woman with 5 kids who suddenly has 5 kids at home because the schools aren't closed because of we need to prevent integration. And you're like, that is it. And then you become like a radical integrationist, right? Like those types of stories I think are really fascinating. And especially in movies and cinema and broader storytelling, white people in the civil rights era are either like the Klan or like the people who are fighting alongside, and there's no one in between. And this is a whole book about the people in between.
That's awesome. My mom tells a story. My mom grew up in South Carolina, and so right around integration, and it was like the chair of the NAACP and his daughter. They're trying to integrate grade at the high school. They sent a letter out that was like this daughter's act, like the school board did that as a way of intimidation. And my grandfather, who I loved him, but he was a very, very racist, was like, you're not going to school with those people. And then realized that he couldn't move and like didn't have the money to get to the place where he didn't have to integrate, like he get out further away. And then he's like, well, you can't hang out with them. It was just an interesting, she like talks about this, his realization that his economic space was so similar to the economic space that these quote unquote others were, that it was just it's a fascinating thing. Dr. Kathryn Edwards, thank you so much for your time. I'm so excited. This has been so much fun for me. So if listening, please look up Keds_Economist on TikTok, and your Optimist Economy podcast, your Substack, anything else you want to, your book will be coming out in the next year or 2 or 5, or we'll be looking for that whenever that is.
Don't worry. I will get in touch and tell you to pre-order the hardback. We will get there.
Look forward to it. I will read it very quickly. I'm excited. Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your work, and have a wonderful day.
Cheers.